let's hear from Elena first, and then we'll come back for a wider discussion.
So I just have a couple of comments just as a reflection on what Jerry and Abdullah have said. So on the UAE, I would just add and sorry, Noel actually spoke on the UAE, getting mixed up. So I just have written down Noel in my notes. So responding to something Noel said, which is the just a bit about the UAE's present situation in Yemen. It's kind of interesting because they're pretty hands off now. And to Jerry's question, which is what I was thinking about in the chat, where he basically says, and I think you're right, Jerry, if you don't mind me mentioning it, but you know, the UAE a lot of folks think the UAE strategy on Yemen has been part of a larger Red Sea strategy. And now they're sort of backing out of a Assab base in Eritrea, but as Noel rightly said, potentially building an airstrip or something or other in Param Island. So, you know, it's a little bit confusing what's going on there. The Socotra story is really confusing. I'll be totally frank that I have been trying for years to get to the bottom of that, and I don't think I'll be able to until I go to Socotra again. I have contacts in Socotra. I have contacts on both sides of the situation in Socotra, and I just can't quite get the what I trust to be the real story. And so I would just be very cautious of any media about Socotra unless the person has literally been there and conducted dozens of interviews on the island. I would be very hesitant to believe anything that you read, either pro-UAE or anti-UAE. But the UAE is mostly hands-off on Yemen right now. And so that's not to say that I mean, everything Noel said about the UAE's role is absolutely correct in terms of building these forces in the south, in terms of supporting Tariq. They're still supporting Tariq, of course. They're still supporting the STC, but in a much more hands-off manner than before. And in ways that have led me to question exactly how much leverage they have, and it's always a question of how much leverage anybody has over Yemenis, as Noel knows. We always like to think it's 100%, right? Because it's such an easy narrative, like, oh, the UAE can just tell the SDC to do XYZ. And it just actually doesn't really work that way. And so, but there is some amount of leverage. So the question is just kind of where on the scale is it? And by backing away from the conflict, the UAE has protected itself from Western narratives about its involvement and all sorts of things, but it also gives up some of that leverage when they're, for example, no longer paying salaries to the security belt folks on the ground, things like that. So, you know, and now Anwar Gargash has left his position and these two people have come in to replace him. And it's a little bit unclear right now who is really in command of Yemen policy in the UAE, just because we're in this kind of transition in the foreign ministry. So of course, Reem al-Hashimi does work on Yemen, but more kind of on the humanitarian side. So I think there's some shuffling around in the UAE, and they're just less hands-on than before. And they also have always been very cautious about being too close to the Saudis in Yemen. So when the Saudis operated in one place, the UAE operated in another. They never operated in tandem. And that was intentional because their militaries are not similarly trained. So and so now the UAE claims to be entirely focused solely on counterterrorism in Yemen, and also in, you know, supporting Tariq, but you know, there's lots of rumors about UAE support for other things, and exactly what are they doing with the STC these days. The UAE says, you know, the STC is helpful with counterterrorism, but that's really our only aim. And it's just a little bit unclear and harder to get an answer now that they're just not talking about Yemen as much. So anyway, so those are my comments on the UAE. And then just one quick comment on Oman I think Abdullah made a really great point about how the Omanis really welcome everybody. So um, the way that I describe Oman and the way it's been described to me is that if brother and sister are fighting, then brother and sister are welcome to come to my house to stay until the fight blows over. But what becomes awkward is when brother says, I'll come stay with you, then sister suddenly feels like she can't. So, then it gives the impression that, Oman is taking brother's side when Oman is saying, no, no, both of you are welcome, right? And so to make that a realistic analogy, Oman has said everyone's welcome to come to Oman, but the reality is the groups that aren't already in Saudi or the UAE are the ones who went to Oman. So then it looks like all the groups that are anti-UAE and anti-Saudi are in Oman, i.e. Oman is anti-UAE, anti-Saudi, which is not how Oman would characterize itself. So I think Abdullah's point that there are Islahis and some STC and some Hadi government, that there's people from other parties in Oman, and there certainly have been in the past. The STC, the Al Baid family was in Oman for a long time. So I just think that that's a really critical sort of nuance to understand. And then I would also just add that Oman was very critical in the GCC initiative in 2011, and I just have always wondered if we can have a GCC initiative too. And it would be a very different document. Like we could have a whole day conversation about what that looks like. But I just think Oman really likes the construct of the GCC. And I think that they could potentially push for something like that if we could figure out, or Yemenis could figure out what a GCC initiative 2 actually means. Like, what does the document actually say? But just conceptually, I think that they would like that sort of collective arrangement, looking like the region is supporting Yemen. Anyway, Jerry may have some other thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'd like to hear Jerry, but let me say Alex raised his hand, so let me give first right of questioning to Alex. But I'd also like to have Abdullah come back in. Abdullah, I didn't hear you say what is the Omani view of the Riyadh agreement and what position the leadership in Muscat took on that. But please, Alex, Vatanka, ask your question.
Thanks, Stephen. I'll be very quick. And actually, my question was really along these lines for Abdullah. Abdullah, could you see and perhaps give us a little bit of history of any possible Omani role in bringing the Saudis and the Iranians together on Yemen or anything? I'm just curious, what's the latest, if there is anything, and maybe a bit of history in terms of what Muscat has been able to do over the years, along the lines of what Oman has done in US-Iran kind of context.
I think Oman does not stop in terms of, trying to offer its services to all the countries in the region to talk and have dialogue. Even, during the Shah's time, for example, if you want to go back to history, Oman invited the Shah of Iran and invited other GCC states, and also they at that time was talking about maybe a security arrangement that included Iran at the time and Iraq. That obviously did not go any further, but the concept itself led to the GCC at the end, which was kind of very limited and excluded both Iran and Iraq and Yemen, unfortunately, to some extent, if you like. It would have been great to have all the countries in the region, even if they were not part of the core, but at least to have some kind of a forum for them to talk and to have a dialogue and to cooperate and build, do some confidence building measures, as well as economic cooperation. During the Iran-Iraq war, Oman has always been, extremely helpful in trying to open its, its services and offer its services to, end the war and dialogue between both, Iran and Iraq, and also involved the Saudis. So it always played some kind of a role. The Omani's policy is always kind of vague and very quiet, and their diplomacy is not something that you know, that they go and shout about, or it's not in the media. And some of these meetings even take place without us being, you know, knowledgeable about, or the media being knowledgeable about. But I think they're always been trying to do that. I think at some point there was a fatigue, perhaps, that was Oman has, Omani diplomacy has reached, especially with, you know, with the fact that they could not see that Iran and Saudi Arabia are going to talk with each other. And obviously, maybe there were some very old people in the ministry, or people who are just got tired of this. And now we have a new leadership in Oman, not only for the country, but also in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and some young people who work with him. And I think they are trying to reinvigorate that. But to what extent, I don't know, because Oman is not known for, you know, country with very major initiatives, if you like. It's just very easy, simple, subdued, if you like, way of doing things. So just trying to reconcile and negotiate and mediate, but not to take major initiative in that front. On the, I hope I answered that one way or the other. But in your question, Stephen, was Oman welcomed the Riyadh announcement, and you know, I think this is also goes to what I was trying to say earlier, that Oman is, you know, trying to mend any kind of misunderstanding, or mend the relationship with Saudi Arabia and overcome any misunderstanding with Saudi Arabia. So it welcomed, obviously welcomed the Riyadh agreement, and there were, you know, there were questions that always are raised, whether Oman actually supports the STC or supports the separation of north-south of Yemen. If you look at it from maybe a strategic viewpoint, Oman maybe could benefit from having Yemen divided and having two smaller countries, or at least a smaller country, its neighbor, than a very large country like Yemen. But at the same time, Oman does not want to interfere in this. You know, they see themselves, this is not our decision. This is entirely a Yemeni internal domestic issue. They have to decide on this. If they decide they want to separate, we will support them. If they decide they want to be together, we will support them. But we are not going to take a position on the Yemen. We support a united Yemen as it is now. But if the Yemenis decided at the end they want to separate, that is their own decision. But Oman will support whatever the outcome of a Yemeni reconciliation. They are not trying to take a position. That's very Omani kind of policy.